Hello, kindred explorers of the ancient mysteries. This is Govin here with TeutonicShamanism.com. The idea that we can keep breaking down humanity into more and more specific groups, I've always found to be a fascinating one. Obviously, many of us have gone through a period where that is seen as wrong to do or politically incorrect or even unscientific. However, you simply have a set characteristic you're looking for, whether it's cultural or even biological, and you get more and more specific. Especially when you get so specific that people look similar, you start simply talking about the genetic similarities, which is how they've been able to do things like the 23andMe test, where you can find out your exact ancestral breakdown because populations existed in fairly insular groups up until very recently. What I found quite fascinating in exploring this whole topic is that not only can we go to the point of saying, well, there's broad things, like I did a video on my Govin Kilgore channel recently called the 6 European sub-races, and we can even take one of those again, which we often talk about on this channel, which is the Teutonic traditions, or the spiritual traditions associated with the Germanic tribes or Norse or Nordic peoples, and you can break them down even further. And this was already done and was recognized, and there was broad regions described, and there was usually many tribes within a region, but they had one overarching name. And I'm going to refer to various pictures to help clarify this as we go through this video. But the first one I'm just going to show you is a general picture that is of the Germanic tribal areas. So this is Scandinavia, sort of Germany and some surrounding countries, obviously Belgium and the Netherlands, and also mainland England and Iceland up in the corner. You also have a little fragment down in the corner which you can't really see, but it is Transylvania. And actually in the 1300s, or perhaps it even began earlier than that, but in the 1300s, I know that was one period where they were prominent, the Saxons had been hired to basically set up villages and a region there to help thwart off the invading Ottoman Empire. So they actually helped at times Vlad Dracula. Vlad Dracula wasn't a Saxon, but I believe that was how the English royalty that's present today became connected with Vlad Dracula in their lineage. At some point, perhaps one of Dracula's descendants married a Saxon person, and then they were the royalty of the region, and then that got passed down and brought back at some point as well. So there are some ties that spread this whole region and connect them all together. Now, that also isn't to say that there aren't many other regions that were influenced culturally and genetically by Teutonic peoples. Basically, all of Europe has some percentage that you could say is Germanic or Teutonic. Even as far south as the Spartans were said to have been a very Germanic peoples in terms of their characteristics. You, of course, have the Franks, the Lombards in Italy, the Vandals, and all these other groups. But, again, we don't really recognize those as Germanic peoples because it's not the most dominant genetic background of those people. And they also don't have Germanic languages anymore. So that really is a defining characteristic. So any country that's in this picture that I showed was, German, Dutch, English, various Scandinavian languages. They all come out of Proto-Germanic. Now, that region, specifically if we zoom in, and because this is going back fairly far, it was before England was populated with Germanic tribes, the Angles and Saxons, etc. And you can see 5 groups there. And that's North Germanic, which is sort of the edge of Scandinavia. There's the North Sea Germanic, or Ingvaeonic, which we're going to talk about in this video, which is kind of the area of Denmark and going up into northern Netherlands. Those would be the countries today. You have the West Rhine Germanic, or Isvaeonic, the Elbe Germanic, or Ermanonic, and then East Germanic. So the term Ingvaeonic, or the people are called the Ingvaeons, is a collection of roughly 4 different groups. And even within that, you can get into very specific tribes. But, those very specific tribes go through a lot of change. Different ones pop up. Some probably blend together and one disappears into the other. Those might even be more aptly described as clans within the greater tribe. So the tribe, or the 4 tribes of the Ingvaeons, which in this first picture there's actually only 3, but we'll talk about the 4th one right afterwards. You have the Jutes right on the jutting tip. I'm not sure if that's the exact origin of the word jut, like to jut out. Just on an intuitive point, that might be it. Then you have the Angles sort of in the middle, and the Saxons, basically, which today would be part of Germany, which is Saxony. Then in this picture you can see the area that is the Frisia, or the Frisians, where they would be located. And there's actually part of the Netherlands today that's called Frisia. Whether or not the people there are the actual descendants of the Frisiae is unknown, because there was some recordings that they were almost completely wiped out, if not wiped out and they moved somewhere else. So there might have been another group, possibly the Saxons, that moved in and became the Frisians that we see today. I'm not entirely certain on that, so don't quote me. But if we go back to this picture, you can see that red part, which is the Ingvaeonic sort of tribal lands. You can see that part that comes down across, I guess it's the other way, if I do the mirror of it. That would be the Frisian lands. And then that part that comes up and curves around and juts up, which is Denmark today, is the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. So all 4 of these groups at varying times came over and populated England. The most dominant 2 are the Angles and Saxons, which is why you just have the term Anglo-Saxon to describe sort of the major ethnic group of England. There's obviously a certain amount of mixing with the Brittonic peoples that were there, but a lot went down into Cornwall and remained ethnically their own group. And then you also have Wales and the Picts in Scotland that remain their own group. Some of the Brittonic peoples got pushed into Scotland and sort of became one with them as well. And those were the Celtic groups. And even though ancestrally the Celts and Germanic peoples were very similar, because over time these people started to look a little bit different, just in terms of various features. But down through the ages, that's more or less what became the British Isles, is the amalgamation of these different groups, with some further admixture of later Danes that were Vikings that were basically coming on and at one point took over vast quantities of land. We also had Norwegian Vikings that were landing and intermixing, but also pirating, or Viking is the verb of to be a pirate in that sense of the Norsemen. You also had that happening along the coast of Scotland. And you also had the Normans, which were a Viking settlement in northern France, the Normandy region. They came over at one point and influenced England. And they also brought over the French language, which intermixed with Old Germanic or Old English and started the process of turning that into the modern English we have today. So this is a large part of my ancestry, which is why I'm fascinated by it. But the Ingvaeonic peoples make up the most dominant ethnic group within England. I'm not sure overall, if you include the entire UK, what the percentage of that would be, but I still think it makes up the majority. And the lore and the stuff we can talk about around the term Ing or Ingvi, and the possible origin of these people, I think kind of foretells and describes some of the characteristics of not just the past history of the British Isles, but also the characteristics of individual people from there. That could be reading into it a bit too far, but I just find this interesting. So what does the term Ingvi or Ingvaeon even mean? Well, it means the descendants of the people of Ingvi. And Ingvi was the name for Freyr. If you're familiar with Norse mythology, Freyr is actually translated as Lord, so Freyr isn't the name of the deity that is commonly called Freyr. It's actually Ingvi. And he was one of 3 Vanir that came to live with the Aesir. So the Aesir are the sort of main pantheon of deities, the Odin, Thor, Frigga, Loki, etc. They had some of the Vanir come live with them in Asgard when the historic battle between the Aesir and Vanir took place, and the Aesir won. So to keep the peace, they exchanged hostages, although they weren't hostages in the sense of they kept them under lock and key. They just came to live with them. So along with Freyr came Freya, his sister, and their father Njord. So the three Vanir that came to live with the Aesir. The term Ingvi is also related to the rune Ing. This rune in the Old Norse is shown as a square. There isn't anything written about it in the Old Norse poems, whether it's Icelandic or the Nordic one, because for any rune there's the possibility of information about it in any of the three rune poems. However, in this case we only have the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. And by the way, in the Anglo-Saxon writing it looks a little different. It looks like this. So I'm going to read it here. Ing was the first amidst the East Danes, so seen until he went eastward, over the sea. His wagon ran after, thus the Herdings named that hero. Somewhat cryptic, but it's kind of obvious from the start that it's talking about the region where the Ingvaeonic peoples came from, of Denmark. And it's talking about their origin from Ing. So we can get further into Ing in a second, but let's just go back to Freyr, or Ingvi, and talk a bit about him. He's a phallic god, a little more earthy than perhaps some of the Aesir. And that was actually said to be the difference between the Aesir and the Vanir. The Vanir were a little more earthy, often much more associated with fertility. He's often depicted with a wild boar and a sword. That kind of has several symbolic representations. Obviously, the sword kind of being phallic, the boar having the idea of abundance and meat and harvest. So not just harvest in terms of plant harvest, because he was associated with that as well, but also of game and wild meat. And he was a very popular deity throughout Teutonic peoples because he represented sexual fertility and wealth and abundance. So these were two things everyone wanted ample amounts of. Another one of Freyr's symbolic possessions is a ship called Skidbladnir, or Skidbladnir. And he was able to fold it up and keep it in a small bag, and it always held a favorable wind. So whether this was foretelling of the might of the British Empire on the seas in later centuries could be related. Of course, that could simply just have to do with the fact that they were on an island and needed to have mobility on the seas to do what it is that they strove to do. But one could argue that there's sort of an internal will and drive that could be inspired, if not ingrained through this mythology within the peoples that took over a large part of the British Isles. So going back to the rune, Ing, or Ingvi, it is a very ancient rune. It's one of the ones that have the oldest or most in-depth history to it, possibly, we could argue. I've talked about it in a previous video, having a relationship to the term Agni, which is an Indian term describing sort of a primordial fire, internal fire of very masculine quality of action. It's related to Kundalini. So whether there's the original connection going back to the Indo-European peoples, the tribes there, we don't know, but it does sound similar and they have similar meanings. So Ing as a rune has to do with that sort of going inwards to that place of internal, almost like solitude, and then having action and fire burst forth from that place, which has its relationship to fertility and sort of that creative drive. So I think that aptly describes the peoples of this group. I'm also going to put a link below to a podcast by someone I enjoy somewhat regularly. They're not putting out much new content, unfortunately, but I think he's still around, putting the occasional thing out, whether you look at his YouTube channel or other sources. But he did an entire 1 to 2 hour talk on his findings about the Ing rune and just what Ingwas means. And he connects it to this very old primal deity, the Ing deity, which goes even further back than just being connected to Freyr. You could almost think of it like the first discovery of fire. You had humans out in the wilderness being very alone, and when they discovered fire, expanded all these possibilities for technology, for survival, and going further than they had ever gone before, from being able to discover this very unique thing that no other animal was able to harness the power of. So to me, that's what Ing really represents, even though it's not written in the rune poem, but that just feels like a very apt description of it, that it's this unique, going internally solitude type rune, which then springs forth and gives new light to ourselves. There's also the possibility that our adding on of ing to the end of words, there's two different ways it's done, is obviously to an action, bringing it into the present, such as do, to do in the future becomes doing in the present. There's obviously nouns with ing as well, like packaging. You have packaging on something, but you can also do the act of packaging something. So there's the action, but there's also things that have the ing. But we're talking about the action. The origin of that might be related to ing, in that it was seen as an action doing fiery, explosive thing. So that became how linguistically people brought a word to mean doing something in the present. And coming back to the Ingvaeonic people before they came over to the United Kingdom, they were their own separate tribes. However, when they came over to England, to the British Isles, they became the Angles and Saxons, and the Jutes and Frisians kind of got absorbed into them. The Angles really did actually take up most of northern England, and then the Saxons were along the bottom portion. But over time, again, there's so much similarities between these groups that they became the Anglo-Saxons. But it is really the amalgamation of four groups, with the Jutes and the Frisians not being as prominent in terms of overall population. And there are some theories that the nobility that at least came over with the Jutes may have been massacred, and thus the peoples then became ruled over by the Saxons and then incorporated into their population. We don't know for sure what happened there, but the larger groups incorporate the smaller ones. But we have to kind of, I think, look back on these four groups and acknowledge them as being part of our ancestral history. If you are someone who has a large portion of your background that's British, and look back on it with pride and with the knowledge of these things, because it's really important to go back to pre-Christian history, I believe. There's a lot there within the mythology that I think can give us some unique insights into our own lives and our own identity. So let me know what you think about this video in the comments below. Like, favorite, and share the video if you feel so inclined. And with that, I'll talk to you again soon. Take care, and may your allies, gods, and ancestors be with you.